Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist, the show where one of my writers, in this case Danny, always a treat, thank you Danny, has written me a script, FBI's Most Wanted, Bradford Bishop, the Family Annihilator. I came into work in quite a good mood this morning and this seems like a brilliant way to ruin it because Family Annihilator. Can't we just call it like, I'm always like when there's not that Annihilator is a cool nickname or something like Family Annihilator, but it sounds kind of like, you know, a villain. Whereas can't we just call him Bradford Bishop? Kid. It's always my argument. Anyway, let's just jump into it. The format of the show, I've never read this before. We're going to read it together. Let's go. You never know what kind of monster might be lurking in your own neighborhood. Some of them seem fairly cheerful on the surface. They might bid you good morning, or chat about the shitty weather, or not make too much of a fuss when your drunken attempts at setting off Chinese lanterns in your back garden end up setting fire to their greenhouse. Personal experience there, Daddy. Also, how do you set fire to a greenhouse? It's like made of metal and glass. I feel like a Chinese lantern, which is one of those like paper things that you light a candle under and it flights up into the sky, right? Always thought that was super cool. I think I've done that. When have I done that? I've definitely done that. But who knows exactly what goes on behind closed doors? And who knows what terrible secrets could be hidden away in history? Yeah, I do think about that. Like, isn't there some statistic? Like, you'll walk past so many murderers in a year or something, and you're just like, God damn, hello. Like, you know, you're just in a crowded space, and it's like that some people here have dark secrets, and I wonder what they are. You know, when you're just like on a crowded train platform, or like in a super crammed, like, underground, and you're just like, maybe someone in here's a murderer. Maybe someone in here has done terrible crimes and just gotten away with it. The nice old lady spending all her time feeding the birds. She could be a Nazi war criminal who was personally responsible for the deaths of thousands. That nice young couple who keep chickens in the backyard. They could be spending every Friday night sacrificing chickens to the devil. Yes, they could be, but probably not, right? The bald guy with beard and glasses and a fake English accent. He could be one of those wretched YouTubers. Yes! And that 87-year-old man who likes dogs and still enjoys a round of tennis, he could be on the FBI's 10 most wanted list after murdering his wife, his 3 young children, and his mother in their own home in Maryland in 1976 and somehow evading justice ever since. The fact that this got so specific makes me think that this is a real one. 87 years old though, and playing tennis? I mean, good for him. If you do bump into the latter, it's worth bearing in mind that the FBI still might be willing to stump up £100,000 as a reward for any information leading to his capture. Danny, I imagine that's a typo, because the FBI is probably not stumping up £100,000. I imagine they're stumping up $100,000. It'd be weird if they operated in pounds, because they're, you know, the FBI. He's got a facial mole on his left cheek, if that helps. But what could have prompted a respected and clean-living Foreign Service officer working at the US State Department to suddenly murder his entire family out of the blue? Wait, so he's like a diplomat? Holy don't they have like mega security checks? Like in psychological profiling because they could be turned into spies? Do we know for sure that he was guilty of this horrendous crime, or could he himself have been the victim of a sinister plot? If he's still alive today, how come the FBI have spectacularly failed to track him down at any point over the last 47 years, despite the large number of reported sightings of the suspect all over the world? And with a number of fresh revelations emerging in recent years, are we any closer to figuring out the whole truth and the current whereabouts of the man known by the FBI as the Family Annihilator? I'm already like, good. There's a good conspiracy theory brewing here, isn't there? Because he's like a diplomat, right? Or a foreign service officer is just like the official word for like a diplomat, right? So he's like abroad. Maybe he was like spying and they killed him and his family and they buried him in the desert or something like that, you know? Join us as we pick up the bloody trail of Bradford Bishop and attempt to figure out what drove a decent and committed family man to carry out such an abominable crime and then flee with professional efficiency. If you're already starting to brew suspicions about that elderly bloke in your own neighborhood, I can reveal that this fugitive from justice also likes peanuts and spicy food. But maybe hold on until the end of the video before you swoop in and make that citizen's arrest. In the forest of the night. On March the 2nd, 1976, a North Carolina Forestry Service ranger by the name of Ron Brickhouse was about to get his afternoon completely screwed up. The call came in at about 1 p.m. Smoke had been spotted rising from a remote pocket of woodland situated around 5 miles or 8 kilometers south of Columbia, North Carolina. Mr. Brickhouse, which is an excellent name by the way, may have grouchily assumed that a scurry of local pyromaniac squirrels had been on the rampage again and ignited yet another forest fire, but this one was the result of something far more disturbing. When Brickhouse arrived on the scene, he came across a blaze which had raged across roughly 3 acres of woodland. He battled with the flames alone for 10 minutes before calling for backup on his radio. Mr. Brickhouse is ambitious. He's like, 3 acres? 3 acre blaze? I can handle that myself. And he's like, oh wait, this is getting out of hand. Better call for backup. How about when it's a 3 acre blaze? That's not a small amount of land. Maybe you just call in for that magical plane that drops does it drop water or sand on the forest? I only see it in movies. It kind of looks all white. So maybe it's water? But after the team of rangers had finally dampened the fiery inferno, the smoke gradually cleared to reveal the gruesome cause of the fire. Brickhouse uncovered a very recently dug shallow grave containing the charred remains of 5 bodies, which had all been doused in gasoline. To his horror, he realized that the 2 bodies appeared to be adult women, whilst the other 3 were young boys. But this gruesome discovery was destined to leave the police puzzled for several days, as it was impossible to identify the burnt remains of the bodies, and there had been no recent reports of 2 missing women and 3 missing children. Really? Oh, okay, because if it's his whole family, right, who's going to report them missing? Because you'd be like, if it's a missing child, the parents will report it. But one of them's the murderer, allegedly, and one of them is they're dead. The victims were all dressed in quite expensive designer clothing, some of which had been purchased about 300 miles or 440 kilometers away in a department store in Bethesda, Maryland. Wait, how did this survive? This must be some super high quality. Doesn't clothing burn? I mean, I guess not, actually. It's probably quite fire resistant, isn't it? But this was back in the day. Right? 1970s? 70s, yeah. Did they have super fire-resistant clothing in the 70s? But aside from that, the only other clues found at the scene were fresh tire marks, an empty gasoline can, and a shovel. It was later determined by the state's chief medical examiner, Dr. Paige Hudson, that the victims had been dead for a little while before their bodies had been discarded and set alight in the woods. All the victims showed evidence of enduring sustained assault, although one of the women, possibly in her 60s, hadn't been attacked quite as severely as the others. Dr. Hudson later observed, some people might have survived those injuries, but the emotional aspect of the incident helped kill her. She might have been smothered, or she might have died of fright. It seems that the other younger woman and the 3 children had been assaulted with much more ferocity. As Dr. Hudson noted, I was impressed by the multiplicity of the blows on the victims. All right, Doc, chill out. God damn, whoever did this is an impressive specimen of a man. I mean, wow, the way he beat the shit out of those children, so impressive. He must bench. When you cave in somebody's head with one blow, why keep hitting them? To impress you, Doc, the fact that there were so many bruises to the children struck me as odd. It seemed clear to the police that a particularly sadistic murderer was on the loose, but this was going to be a tough case to crack when nobody even knew the identities of the 5 victims. Dr. Paige Hudson got busy preparing molds of the victims' dental plates to be distributed to every dentist in the region, and fingerprints of all 5 victims had been taken, although it seemed doubtful that they could be matched to any existing records. Wait, weren't they in the middle of a 3-acre fire? Like an inferno? How are they so intact? The only real clue they had to the identity of the killer was found on the shovel, or rather the price tag still attached to the shovel. The price tag included the letters OCH. After contacting the manufacturer of the shovel, North Carolina FBI agents were able to match the letters on the price tag to the exact store from which it was sold. The letters all were taken from the name of Pock's Hardware Store in Bethesda, Maryland, the exact same town, the exact same uncorporated census-designated place if we're being pedantic, from which the clothes of the victims had been bought. But that wasn't massively helpful. It turns out the Pock's Hardware Store shifted literally hundreds of these shovels every month, and the staff were unlikely to vividly recall each and every sale. Yeah, of course. It's surely it's one of the most common things that everyone has, a shovel. I don't think I've used a shovel, but I certainly have one. No, I've used a shovel. There was a dead mouse in the garage, and I used a shovel to throw it outside into the woods. When detectives turned up to the store armed with photographs of the 5 charred victims taken at the morgue, they inevitably drew a complete blank. I don't know, if someone showed me that, I wouldn't have a complete blank. I'd be like, oh my God, why are you showing that to me? Off. Even if the detectives had turned up to the store armed with photographs of 5 people in a slightly healthier state, say alive, the employees would have had a hard time identifying them. Now that I think about it, I'm not even sure why the detectives felt that anyone at the hardware store would have served any of the 5 victims anyway. Surely it would have been the killer rather than the victims who bought the shovel and used it to dig the shallow grave. Yeah, I completely agree, but also they don't have a lot to go on, so maybe they were there while the father was buying the shovel, because he could totally go into the hardware store. I mean, if I went to a hardware store and bought a shovel, my family aren't immediately going to think, oh, are you going to use that to bury us in the woods and set us on fire? No one thinks that. No one thinks that. But whilst it seems the detectives were clutching at straws, in fairness, they had very little else to go on at the time, and there were no missing person reports that matched the 5 victims. All that changed 8 days after Ron Brickhouse's discovery of the bodies. On March the 10th, 1976, Montgomery County Police received a telephone call from a resident of the Carderock Springs neighborhood of Bethesda, Maryland, who was a bit worried about his next-door neighbors. He hadn't heard a whisper from the usually lively Bishop household for well over a week, and now the neighbor was growing increasingly concerned as to the welfare of 39-year-old Bradford Bishop, his 37-year-old wife Annette, their 3 sons, 14-year-old William, 10-year-old Brenton, and 5-year-old Jeffrey, as well as Bradford's 68-year-old mother Lobelia, who had relatively recently moved in with the family. When Detective Joe Sargent made a visit to the house on Lilystone Drive, he was completely unprepared for what he was about to find. Bishop Tonight. Bradford Bishop, full name William Bradford Bishop Jr. Wow, so this dude's name would actually be Bill Bradford Bishop? That's a mouthful. Was born in South Pasadena, California in 1936. It was during his high school years that he first started dating Annette Weiss, the student who would go on to become his wife in 1959 and the mother of his 3 children. Back at South Pasadena High School, Bishop was considered to be an outgoing guy who worked hard and played hard. While he was no genius, he was achieving fairly healthy academic results, and he was a pretty handy quarterback for the school football team, whilst Annette was a cheerleader for that very same team. Wait, this sounds like a high school movie. Is this how life is actually in America? Because it's like, just in TV shows, it's always like, yeah, there's the quarterback, there's the cheerleader, like in every American TV show. Is that actually how life is? It could be that Bishop and Annette's relationship only turned serious after Bishop later graduated from Yale University with a Bachelor of Science degree. Wait, he was no genius. It's Yale! Yale's like a big smart person school, isn't it? It certainly seems he played the field before finally settling down with his high school sweetheart, as just 2 years before their marriage, Bishop had become involved in some sort of dalliance which would generate news headlines about 60 years later. But we'll return to that in about 16 pages or so. Okie dokie. I'm curious. It's going to be good for my viewer retention on YouTube. People stay tuned for that. During the very same year that Bishop and Annette were married, Bishop enlisted in the United States Army. During his 4-year stint in the 163rd Military Intelligence Battalion, he served mainly in Italy, where he was eventually joined by Annette and their first son, William. He also took the time to study the Serbo-Croatian language, and in fact, over the years, Bishop would talk in many tongues as he became a fluent speaker of no less than 5 languages: English, Serbo-Croatian, Italian, French, and Spanish. This guy's no genius. He speaks 5 languages, he went to Yale, and he works in military intelligence. I'd say he's quite clever, no? That might seem quite impressive to anyone who only learned to count to 3 in French. But without wishing to souffler ma propre trompette, I assume that means to blow my own trumpet. I should point out that I'm a fluent speaker of 27 different languages. No, you're not, Danny. Apparently 26 of them aren't officially recognized anywhere in the world, but I don't see what that's got to do with anything. After he accepted an honorable discharge from the army, clutching a single medal for good conduct. I mean, that sounds like you're making fun of him for like having a single medal for good conduct, but he probably wasn't involved in a war. He was just in military intelligence. I imagine most people don't leave the army with a ton of medals, do they? Medals are like rare. He applied for a position as a Foreign Service officer at the US State Department in 1965, where he'd eventually work his way up to Assistant Chief of the Division of Special Activities and Commercial Treaties, which sounds very boring. It sounds like quite a glamorous and exotic job in many ways. I'm like, this sounds like the most boring foreign service job that you could ever have. You want to be like, I don't know, CIA head of station or something from the movies, like ambassador, attaché. All these words, I'm not really sure what they mean, but they sound important. I mean, I know what ambassador means. I'm not quite sure I know what attaché means, but it sounds cool. He was packed off around the world over the course of the next decade to work in places such as Florence, Ethiopia, and Botswana. But the actual job itself wasn't massively exciting, as Bishop largely made use of his mastery of several languages to help negotiate trade relations with other countries. Actually, that does sound pretty interesting. I take it back. That sounds like a pretty cool job. There's a little disagreement over how he was regarded by his peers and his employers. One former colleague claims that Bishop was a highly respected officer with an exemplary track record, but it's interesting to note that he very nearly didn't get the job of Foreign Service officer at all. During an initial security evaluation, it was observed that Bishop showed weakness in judgment, discretion, and the ability to evaluate possible course of action. The writer of the report concluded that he was reluctant to recommend Bishop's appointment as a Foreign Service officer. However, this conclusion appears to have been ignored unless Bishop was given a second chance to up his game before he was given the position, and he had learned how to exercise judgment, discretion, and the ability to evaluate possible course of action. It sounds just like the most bureaucratic speak that I've ever heard. I'm so glad that I don't have to do... Everyone has this, right? You leave university and it's like you have to do job applications. They ask you all these ridiculous questions that are super specific, and everyone's obviously just kind of not making up the answers, but it's very embellished, and you got to prepare for these interviews and stuff. I hated doing that. It's like just working for free on the hope that someone will give you a job that you don't really want. By the time we get to 1976, it looked as if Bishop's traveling days were over. He was now working in a permanent desk position in Washington, D.C., prompting the family to move to a nice new home in the nearby Cataract Springs neighborhood of Bethesda, Maryland. The residents of the house at 8103 Lilystone Drive were now a family of 6. Along with Bishop, Annette, and their 3 sons, William, Brenton, and Jeffrey, the family were now joined by Bishop's mother, Lobelia, who had recently lost her husband and had provided substantial financial help with the down payment on the new house. They were a family of 7, if we're counting the beloved pet dog Leo. There always seems to be a dog in these stories, and now I'm feeling a little bit worried. Oh no, they're going to kill the dog. Is the dog going to be there as well? Probably not, right? Just lets the dog go. It's not like the dog can snitch on you. The Bishops were known to be a happy and sociable family who enjoyed a wide range of outdoor pursuits. Annette was a stay-at-home mum who was a regular competitor at the Cataract Springs Tennis and Swim Club, and who had very recently begun to pursue her dream of becoming an artist by enrolling in a full-time art class at the University of Maryland. Lobelia was a regular face about town, as she usually did all the shopping and acted as the unofficial taxi driver for the kids. She would even take their evening paper rounds if the children were busy doing something else more productive that night. 4-year-old Jeffrey was still in nursery, whilst the other 2 boys were very much athletic types. Brenton was a strong swimmer and keen skateboarder, whilst oldest son William was an accomplished gymnast and basketball player. But although former neighbours and friends have plenty to say about the rest of the Bishops, they aren't usually quite so vocal about Bradford, who appeared to have been a quieter presence in the community and was sometimes described as intense and absorbed. He was a licensed amateur pilot who had first learned to fly during his service in Botswana. This dude has a pretty interesting life. I gotta say, I'm like, this dude sounds like... I know he's known as the family Annihilator or whatever, but I'm like, sounds like a pretty interesting dude. Traveling around the world, negotiating trade, flying planes, riding motorbikes. He was also a bit of an outdoorsman who enjoyed camping, skiing, hiking, canoeing, and riding motorbikes. I love riding motorbikes, but I don't ride motorbikes because it's way too dangerous. Like... my wife, even if I was like, it's not, no, it's fine, it'll be fine. My wife was like, you are not riding a motorbike. And I'll be like, yeah, fair shout. Aside from that, we don't really know too much about the man himself, other than his love for peanuts and spicy food. Only he looks a bit like Quentin Tarantino, and he apparently is very fond of dogs too. What the neighbours and friends may not have known is that Bishop was also battling with chronic insomnia and was taking treatment for depression. It's also believed that he may not have been entirely happy with his current career situation. Bishop was reported to be bored and frustrated with his new desk-bound job and longed for a posting on another international mission, which would take him far away from Washington, D.C. Really? I'd imagine like by the time you've had a family and stuff, like I used to like travel. I used to like visiting new places. And now I'm just like, oh my God, that sounds like companies will be like, can you come and do this thing? Can you do that? We'll pay you money. And I'm like, nah, that sounds like I'd have to go somewhere. And I just don't want to. I just don't want to. It's like I got a family now. I just want to stay at home. I just want to go to work, do my job, which I like, go home, see my family who I like. I don't want to go away for like a few days to go and do something that I don't want to do. I just want to stay at home. It's so boring. Love it. Still, he was now feeling hopeful that he may have secured a big promotion, and the morning of March 1st, 1976 was when he found out if he was ready to take another step up the ladder of the US State Department. It wasn't good news, and it might be said that he took it rather badly. That morning, Bradford Bishop turned up as usual to the office in Washington, D.C., and made it his business to check out the annual promotions list, which had been pinned to the notice board. His name was noticeably absent. Immediately after perusing this list, he told his secretary that he was feeling a bit under the weather and that he'd be taking the rest of the day off work. As he left the building, he bumped into his colleague and friend, Roy Harrell, who was surprised to hear that Bishop had been passed over for promotion. Roy felt that Bishop's international experience made him the prime candidate for promotion, an opinion most likely shared by Bishop himself. Roy noted that Bishop looked unusually despondent during their brief conversation outside the office. Bishop explained that he was going home for the rest of the day, as he thought he was coming down with the flu, and then wandered off to his car. But he didn't drive straight home. From what the police managed to piece together of his movements that day, Bishop first stopped off at the American Security Bank, where he withdrew everything he had in his account, a grand total of $400. That's it. Aren't you like a successful guy working at the State Department? You should have more than $400 in your bank account. He then moved on to a Texaco station where he filled up his 1974 Chevrolet station wagon before moving on to a branch of Sears where he bought a sledgehammer and a gas can. His final purchases that day were from Park's hardware store where his credit card was used to buy a pitchfork and a shovel. It's believed that Bishop didn't return home until late in the evening, and that his mother, Lobelia, was out walking the dog at the time. It appears that Annette had been reading a book in the living room when Bishop approached his wife of 17 years and bludgeoned her to death with a sledgehammer. He is then thought to have moved upstairs to the bedrooms where the children were, now in their pajamas, and may even have been asleep in bed. Bishop used the sledgehammer to kill 14-year-old William, 10-year-old Brenton, and 4-year-old Jeffrey. What the f*** happened to your brain? This feels like some brain tumor shit, where it's just like suddenly he just lost his mind because he's got some brain tumor pushing on the wrong part of his brain or something. This seems mad. Shortly afterwards, Lobelia arrived back home and she too was fatally attacked, although her exact cause of death was unknown as her wounds weren't as severe as the others. It's worth pausing to remember the words of Dr. Page Hudson here when he observed the multiplicity of the sledgehammer blows to the children and questioned why anybody would continue striking the young victims even after it was obvious that the first strike had done fatal damage. It would now appear that the perpetrator of this hideous act wasn't just anybody, it was the father of the children. Bishop is thought to have wrapped the bodies in blankets and placed them in his station wagon before making the long night journey to the North Carolina woods over a distance of around 300 miles or 440 kilometers. He wasn't entirely alone on the journey. Leo, the family's dog, had been spared from the brutality and was the only other living passenger on the 6-hour ride. After parking in a remote spot of woodland, he dug a shallow grave into which he piled all 5 bodies before dousing them with gasoline and setting them on fire. It's possible that he may have panicked a little when the fire got out of control, and so he left the shovel and the empty gas can behind as he jumped back in the car and sped away from the scene. Several hours later, Forestry Service Ranger Ron Brickhouse would receive a call alerting him to reports of smoke rising from the trees. This feels like a very sloppy cleanup for a crime for someone who's quite intelligent, because by setting the fire, you're just going to attract attention to the area. Surely if you're just in the middle of nowhere, just leave the bodies buried. And around the exact same time that all of this was unfolding, an 18-year-old student by the name of Kathy Gilchrist was being crowned Miss Staunton in a modest ceremony in the Massachusetts town about 700 miles away from North Carolina. This might seem massively irrelevant right now, but hold that thought. It does. Like, how on earth does this relate? Escape to the Smoky Mountains. When Detective Joe Sargent of Montgomery County Police Department was instructed to visit 8103 Lilystone Drive after a worried neighbor had expressed concern, the first thing he noticed was drops of blood on the front step. He obviously wasn't going to find any bodies within the house itself, but he was certainly going to find a lot more blood. The detective later reported, "It was rather routine to do an investigation like this. I wasn't overly concerned about it until I reached the front step of the home and I noticed there were blood drops on the front step. Upon opening the front door, I saw blood droplets leading from the hallway through to the foyer and up a set of stairs that led to the upper bedroom level of the home. In going up the stairs, I observed blood splatterings on the wall and in the one bedroom that I could see into. Almost the entire ceiling and wall was splattered with blood. There was hardly a place you could put your hand where there weren't blood splatterings. I'd been a police officer for approximately 12 years. And this was the worst scene I've ever observed." Another officer later revealed that he felt the most disturbing discovery of all of this in the horror house was not so much the bloodstains, but the huge sledgehammer marks in the ceiling directly above the top bunk bed, again indicating the sheer savage intensity of the blows that were being struck on a young child. There had been a gap of 10 days between the murders and the police entering the house on Lilystone Drive, although it was a very nearly different story. A friend and neighbor, Alvina Long, had called round to Bishop's house the very next day after the murders to see if the kids fancied a trip to the swimming pool. She saw that the back door was slightly ajar, but there was no answer from within. She briefly peeked inside the house, but saw nobody around the kitchen, so she walked away, assuming that the family had nipped out. Had she investigated a little further, the police may have been on the case a whole 9 days earlier, which could potentially have made a big difference. But of course, it's probably considered quite rude to just wander into somebody else's kitchen, as if you own the place, you never know what the neighbors might be getting up to in the privacy of their own home. Yeah, this is completely reasonable behavior. It's not like, why would she be suspicious? She's got no reason to be suspicious. It seems just like a random nice family. It's also possible that there may have been 2 more victims if certain plans hadn't changed at the very last minute, and one of them was something of a celebrity figure. I'll admit that I've never heard of the award-winning American ballet dancer Jacques d'Amboise, but he was apparently quite a big name if you're into that sort of thing. In his 2011 autobiography, I Was a Dancer, he revealed that he once briefly lived with Bishop's parents back in South Pasadena when both he and Bradford Bishop were teenagers. Jacques revealed that he found the young Bradford Bishop to be super smart, analytical, and somewhat remote. The ballet dancer had remained friends with the family ever since, particularly with Lobelia. And when he was scheduled to perform at the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts in 1976, Lobelia invited Jacques and his wife to spend the night at the Bishop household in Maryland. In the end, the performance was cancelled at the 11th hour as Jacques suffered a knee injury which prevented him from making the trip. But this agonizingly painful knee injury may well have saved his life. The night in question was February the 29th, 1976. Oh, a leap year, there you go. Is that right? Yeah, February 29th. And Jack points out in his book that both he and his wife Carrie would likely still have been in the house the following day when Bishop returned home from work with a sledgehammer in his hand. Perhaps the murders may not have taken place at all on that night had Jack and his wife been present, or perhaps the number of victims would have increased by 2. As Jack himself pondered, would our presence have somehow deflected or deferred the killings? Or would we have added our own blood to the house? Considering the bishop had already decided to murder his own wife, mother, and 3 sons, I'm not sure that the prospect of dealing with 2 other guests would have delayed his plans, but you never know. Maybe. Because dealing with an elderly woman, a woman and 3 children, is a lot different from dealing with, I assume, a fairly athletic ballet dancer. Of course, without any actual bodies, it was difficult at first to ascertain exactly what had happened in 8103 Lilystone Drive, and there were initial concerns for all 6 members of the household, including Bradford Bishop. But a connection was quickly made between the scene at Lilystone Drive and the discovery of the bodies of 2 women and 3 children 300 miles away in the North Carolina woodland. The same morgue photographs that had failed to spark any recognition at Poch's hardware store were now shown to neighbors and friends of the missing family, who identified the faces as Annette Lobelia, William Brenton, and Jeffrey Bishop. This was officially confirmed by dental records shortly after. The finger of suspicion now also naturally drifted in the direction of Bradford Bishop, who rapidly evolved from being a missing person to a person very much sought by the police for questioning, to a person who was now wanted on suspicion of murder. Yeah, I don't think the finger would drift there. I think it would immediately snap towards him as being like, oh, weird, you're missing and your whole family are dead. You're suspect number 1, Braddy boy. And the evidence quickly began to stack up when it was discovered that after Bishop's final curtailed day at the office, he had used his credit card to purchase the sledgehammer, the gas can, and the shovel. This wasn't the last time his credit card was used, though. A few hours after the bodies were believed to have been buried in the woods, Bishop's credit card was again used to purchase a pair of tennis shoes from a store in Jacksonville, North Carolina, about 125 miles or 40 kilometers south of the shallow grave. The owner of the store, John Wheatley, later told Montgomery County Police that he had sold the tennis shoes to a polite and well-spoken man who matched Bishop's description. And he wasn't alone. The man was accompanied by a dog and a woman. Okay, hello, that's a twist. John Wheatley felt that the man and the woman seemed very much like a couple. The woman was holding the dog on a leash outside the store as the man nipped in quickly to buy the shoes. The description of the woman was pretty vague, not surprising if she didn't even enter the store, but Wheatley remembered that she was wearing a beautiful dress and she looked as if she may have been Caribbean in nature. It wasn't until March the 18th that the next big discovery was made at a parking lot at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And no, thankfully, we're not talking about more murder victims. We're instead talking about the recovery of a certain 1974 Chevrolet station wagon belonging to Bradford Bishop, which was eventually located in an isolated campground in the Great Smoky Mountains near Oakmont, Tennessee, about 400 miles from where the bodies had been set alight. The abandoned, blood-stained vehicle was spotted by a ranger who initially assumed that it had run into another backpacker until a check on the license plate revealed the identity of the owner. The spare tire well in the trunk was drenched in blood, while several items of interest were found inside the car, including a blood-stained blanket, credit card receipts, a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun, an axe, a sports jacket, a shaving kit, a packet of dog biscuits, and a batch of prescription medication, which included the tranquilizer Serax that Bishop was taking for his insomnia and depression. After the FBI had arrived on the scene, bloodhounds briefly picked up the scent of Bishop heading in the direction of the Appalachian Trail, but the trail went cold very quickly. Perhaps that's not too surprising, as the scent was now likely to be at least 2 weeks old, and there had been heavy snowfall in the interim. In fact, the conditions weren't great on the actual day of the discovery of the vehicle, as one of the FBI agents had to be excused from duty when he began to suffer from hypothermia. God damn, it must have been cold out. Although over 300 hikers who had been roaming in the same area were later identified and questioned, not a single one of them had seen a man that matched the description of Bishop, or a dog that matched the description of Leo, or a Caribbean woman in a beautiful dress for that matter. Just one day after the vehicle was found, Bradford Bishop was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder by Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. But actually getting hold of the suspect to answer those charges was always going to be a bit tricky, considering that he now had a head start of over 2 weeks. As FBI agent Chuck Lontor glumly noted, a man like Bradford Bishop could go around the world twice in that amount of time. Yeah, Bradford Bishop, if there's anyone who knows how to get abroad and stay there in some safe country without extradition, Like, working for the State Department and having worked your career abroad is definitely going to have made you connections and knowledge that will allow you to go on the run forever, which apparently is what he did. A View to Kill. Family and friends of the Bishops were finding it impossible to process these developments, and several relatives declared that Bishop and Annette always seemed to have a good, strong relationship. There was even plenty of speculation that Bradford Bishop may well have been truly stitched up like a kipper and was perhaps simply a victim himself. I mean, it would have needed to be a pretty elaborate stitch-up, but maybe that's the whole point. Is it possible that Bradford Bishop had actually been working as an international undercover spy during the long period when he was supposedly working for the US State Department, and that this whole ghastly incident was meticulously orchestrated retribution from a nation out for revenge? I don't know, but that's a pretty good defense that a lawyer would go for in court. That's apparently one of the first thoughts that entered ballet dancer Jacques Ambrose's head when he heard the news. He recalls in his autobiography that Belia was always strangely vague about her son's line of work, leading Jacques to suspect that he was some kind of spy. I mean, I don't feel like people have... If you're a spy, and there's very few people who know that you're actually a spy, it's not like you have some sort of vague thing that people are like, oh, he does this and that. It's like, no, you'll have a cover story. You'll have a very well-established cover story. Oh, he works in, like, commercial trade for the State Department. That does sound very spy, doesn't it? But it's like, they wouldn't be vague. They'd be like, I don't know, maybe he's a spy. No. It would be some really boring job. Which makes me think he maybe is a spy. And some of Bishop's own friends later shared their suspicions with Time magazine that Bishop and his whole family may have been the victims of an international operation designed to wreck Bishop's reputation before he himself was murdered. While the notion does seem a bit far-fetched, it was a theory often pondered upon by Ray Knight, a man who served as deputy during the time of the murders, and who would go on to be elected Montgomery County Sheriff a decade later. Ray Knight never gave up on the Bishop case. Even after his retirement in 2010, he still continued to follow leads right up until his recent death in 2023. Long after his retirement, Knight revealed that he'd always suspected Bishop may have been secretly working for the CIA, particularly after a search of his office desk at the State Department uncovered a matchbook bearing the scrawled telephone number of a CIA office based in Langley. Another document was later uncovered at the State Department, which declared that the CIA had carried out a damage assessment of Bishop's potential knowledge of CIA activities shortly after his disappearance, but had concluded that he was not a possible espionage target. During his time as sheriff, Ray Knight even filed a Freedom of Information Act request to the CIA on the grounds that he believed that the case may involve some unknown entity with unlimited resources. That sounds like a nation. But his request was met with a curt response. No records responsive to your request were located. Shortly before his death, Ray Knight fell down a rabbit hole with his suspicions, informing the press that he believed there was a chance that Bishop was an unwitting guinea pig in a 1970s drug experiment carried out on CIA agents, which caused him to completely lose his mind on that day. It does kind of sound like he just lost his fucking mind.
That's Jason Bourne.
The US State Department and the CIA have always consistently denied that Bradford Bishop was a secret super spy, but then they would, wouldn't they? It's not entirely out of the question that he was a spy, although it perhaps seems a little unlikely. He may have worked in counterintelligence during his 4-year stint in the army, but this rarely got any more glamorous than eavesdropping on Yugoslavian broadcasts and providing the Serbo-Croatian translations. If his character had been portrayed in a James Bond movie, it would have been listed in the credits as man with headphones in the background who looks a bit like Quentin Tarantino. And several colleagues at the State Department have come forward to confirm that Bishop was very much a genuine Foreign Service officer rather than a secret undercover agent. As far as they know, it's his cover job. But they could be in on the conspiracy. I mean, even if maybe they just didn't know. I definitely wouldn't discount the part that this dude could be a spy. Even if he wasn't a spy, there are still some who believe that Bishop may have been an innocent victim. It's often noted that the murder weapon was never found, and it's speculated that he may have purchased all those items under duress, or that another party had stolen the credit card and was using a fraudulent signature. Yeah, I mean, using a credit card to buy murder weapons seems way too obvious for an intelligent person. Like, that sounds like someone trying to stitch him up, in my opinion. I'm not sure how much it would really help if the sledgehammer was eventually found. It's most likely going to have his fingerprints on there anyway, because we already strongly suspect that he bought it himself from the hardware store. I don't know, it'd be pretty useful if they found it and it didn't have his fingerprints on it, though. And some of these claims of innocence from family and friends do appear to be desperate attempts to find an answer that might somehow be deemed more acceptable. What we do know for sure is that Bishop left work very early after learning that he hadn't received his promotion, that his credit card was used to purchase a sledgehammer and a shovel later found at the shallow grave, and that his bloody fingerprints were found all over the family home and the car, the latter of which was also heavily stained with the blood of his family members. Now that's pretty good evidence, isn't it? Like bloody fingerprints. We also know that his credit card was used again after the bodies had been discarded by a man who the store owner reckons matched the description of Bradford Bishop, accompanied with a dog that matched the description of Leo. Not that we're accusing Leo of any criminal activity here. Yeah, that's this later evidence stuff. That's much more locked in my opinion. On the whole, it's not looking great for Bradford Bishop, is it? If this really was a stitch-up, then the organisers did a pretty incredible job. But what on earth could have driven him to do such a thing? Surely he can't have been that miffed that he didn't get a promotion. I have a feeling that the woman, the with the beautiful dress, and that Danny mentioned the beauty contest earlier, she's definitely got something to do with it. He's found a new lover or something. Well, that's one theory. Bradford Bishop just completely flipped out and lost the plot that morning. His ongoing battles with depression and chronic insomnia may have played a part in driving him to the tipping point. The psychiatrist who prescribed him the Serax drug refused to speak to detectives at all on grounds that doing so would breach patient confidentiality, but the FBI later revealed the Bishop would get real bad if he didn't take the drug. Shortly after the murders, the Washington Post reported that detectives were stumped for a motive as there was no evidence of infidelity or financial or job problems. But that may have been wrong on all three counts. Didn't we say he had like $400 in his bank account? There's also the random beautiful women and the job problems. So it seems like ding, 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 all of these things might be happening. Bishop clearly wasn't minted, as when he emptied his bank account that morning, he walked away with a total of $400. Not an unhealthy amount of to have floating in your bank account back in 1976, but hardly a fortune. Oh, okay, so it's worth, I don't know, let's say $3,000 today, roughly. So it's not bad. It's reported but not confirmed that the Internal Revenue Service had felt compelled to audit Bishop's taxes at around the time of the murders, which could potentially have been preying on Bishop's mind if his books weren't quite in order. And we should also remember that Lobelia had also felt obliged to help out with the down payment on the new house in Cataract Springs, perhaps indicating that the move might not have been possible without a financial contribution. Yes, I mean, this kind of takes away from my spy theory, because I'm like, if he was a spy, well, he's not necessarily doing it for money, but you'd imagine, like, you know, he's just got some gold bars tucked away somewhere. He's got some, like, secret payments. So he probably, you know, would have more than $400 in his bank account. Roy Harrell, the friend and colleague who spoke to a despondent Bishop outside the office that morning, had suggested that Bishop suffered from an inferiority complex and was under constant pressure from his wife and mother to get a promotion and bring more money into the household. On top of that, it's believed that Bishop desperately longed for another overseas posting, whereas Annette wanted him to stay behind a desk in Washington, D.C. Annette had also begun to pursue her full-time art studies at the University of Maryland, whereas Bishop wanted her to stay home and look after the kids. There may well have been some degree of tension and conflict within a household that was at odds with each other, whilst potentially also beginning to buckle under financial strain. Could Bishop have preferred the idea of murdering his own family rather than face them with the news that he hadn't got the promotion? I mean, that seems a bit insane. Roy Harrell feels it's more likely that Annette and Lobelia had pushed an increasingly trapped Bishop so hard that he just had the urge to put them in their place. God damn, though, dude. Like... But whilst there had been much talk of Bishop just totally flipping out one morning, there's something to be said for the alternative theory that he had planned all of this for quite some time. We already know that he didn't just do all of this in the heat of a single crazed moment. He had plenty of time to change his mind on the long drive home or during his stops to buy all of the equipment. And then there's the matter of the Caribbean woman in a beautiful dress spotted with Bishop a few hours after the bodies were believed to have been buried. We know practically nothing about this mysterious woman, but it seems unlikely that Bishop just randomly bumped into her and asked her to hold his dog for a minute. The store owner reckoned they looked very much like a couple. The FBI much later claimed, without going into detail, that Bishop had become entangled in multiple extramarital affairs over the years. Wait, so that's way different from them being like, no, there's no infidelity, no financial problems, no career problems. You were so wrong at the beginning. Whilst this woman at the store may not necessarily have been his lover, and she certainly may not have been aware of exactly what Bishop had done, it does make you wonder if Bishop had planned all along to elope with a Caribbean woman in a beautiful dress, although that obviously doesn't explain why he felt the need to murder his family first. Then again, it seems a bit fruitless to try and come up with any compelling motive which would make us all conclude, Now I understand why he murdered his wife, his mother, and his 3 young children. Perfectly reasonable. One point that conflicts with the concept of a long-planned strategy is the fact that he bothered turning up for work that morning, albeit very briefly, to check whether he got the promotion, leading many to believe that this was the sole catalyst for his subsequent actions. It may well have been, or it could have been a factor in a horribly twisted long-term plan. Bishop had already decided much earlier that if he didn't get the promotion, he would escape his miserable situation by murdering his family and starting a new life far away from Washington, D.C. Why can't you just start your new life far away from Washington, D.C. without murdering your family? Just don't go home. Just disappear. Why'd you have to kill them? What the f***? That makes no sense. But if he did get the promotion, he would carry on as normal, at least for the immediate future. We may uncover some more clues a little later on, but when you consider that Bradford Bishop managed to completely fall off the grid with professional efficiency without leaving a trail, admittedly helped along by his 2-week head start, this perhaps indicates that he had been plotting beforehand in quite some detail. But where exactly could he have gone? Hide and seek. There's every chance the bishop drew upon his decades of experience working and living overseas to forge a new identity in another country where he blended in with the natives and remained completely undetected. Yeah, he has the skills for that. But as he could have fled to potentially anywhere in the world, this isn't very helpful when it comes to narrowing down the search. Within the space of just a couple of years, some members of Montgomery County Police Department already appeared to have given up on the case, with one policewoman glumly informing the press that the FBI hadn't found anything useful and the police were no longer actively seeking evidence. I mean, you can narrow it down a bit, right? He speaks like those 5 languages, so you'd think he'd go to one of those 5 places so he can blend in a little better. Maybe somewhere that he's been before? You could narrow it down a little bit. I mean, getting him is going to be a whole different matter, because then you've got to coordinate with police in like a bunch of different countries, which sounds like a nightmare. It feels as if quite a lot of people had just shrugged and moved on with their lives. Even the house at Lilystone Drive had been sold to a new family within the space of just 14 months, which does throw up the question of how much time should pass before it's considered socially acceptable to move into a house that was the scene of multiple horrific murders. I mean, I know it could be argued that any unpleasant history of a house has nothing to do with the future lives of the potential new homeowners, and I don't think it should cause you great concern if you find out that someone was murdered in your house hundreds of years ago, unless you're a bit worried about ghosts, which you don't need to be because ghosts aren't real. But I have to admit, I'd still be a bit queasy about living in a house where 2 women and 3 children were murdered just over a year earlier. Yet I have no real idea of how long it would take to become acceptable again. 5 years? 50 years? What? Maybe it's just better to just burn such houses down and rebuild them. However, whilst some police officers appeared to have quickly grown despondent over the prospects of ever catching Bradford Bishop, there were others who have stubbornly refused to let the case die. We've already mentioned Ray Kite, the former sheriff of Montgomery County, who continued to pursue leads after his retirement in 2010. During his last few years in office, Ray Kite's chief deputy was a guy called Darren Popkin, who was only 14 years old when the murders took place. Popkin went on to succeed Ray Kite as sheriff for the next 13 years and proved to be similarly obsessive about chasing down any new leads that might help him track down Bishop. During Ray Kite's retirement dinner, his successor, Popkin, presented him with a somewhat unusual gift which perhaps illustrated their mutual obsession, a huge wanted poster of Bradford Bishop. The intention was for Kite to hang the poster over his fireplace, but Kite's wife had other ideas. In more recent years, the case had been actively pursued on a federal level by FBI Special Agent Stephen Vogt, who we'll return to in a moment, or perhaps 7. But there have certainly been plenty of leads to pursue. This is largely down to the fact that over the years, Bradford Bishop has been spotted mooching about all over Europe. Allegedly. Yep. Bishop has supposedly popped up in all kinds of places, including England, Belgium, Finland, Germany, Spain, and Greece. He's been spotted working in libraries and car washes, and was once spotted as a janitor in a school in California. This doesn't seem very likely. This is like people spotting Elvis. In fact, he's probably been spotted even more times than a post-death Elvis Presley. Danny and I, same page, but just like those Elvis sightings, you have to take a lot of these glimpses of Bradford Bishop with several grains of salt, particularly some of the more recent reports in which someone claims to have identified a person that they never previously met based on a photograph that was taken 40 years earlier. However, 3 of the most intriguing sightings were reported by people who had indeed known Bishop in the past. One of them emerged as early as July 1978 from a Swedish woman who had worked with Bishop during one of his foreign service postings to Ethiopia and had reportedly become quite close to the whole family. The woman claims that she saw Bishop from afar twice in the same week in a public park in Stockholm. He may have been sporting a new beard, but she reckons she was absolutely certain it was him on both occasions and that he appeared to be discreetly following her. She also claims that she didn't bother reporting this to the police at the time, as she didn't know that he was wanted for murder. Yeah, I mean, this was back in the day. It's not, surprising. The sighting was later investigated by the Swedish police and the FBI, but this particular trail led nowhere. We don't have too much information regarding the woman in question, but it does seem odd that she was still completely unaware of the murders of a family to which she'd grown close, carried out by a member of that same family and a former collaborator over 2 years after the event. Yeah, maybe, but this was the 1970s, and it's like, I'm sure people, when they go and they have to work somewhere for a few years, and they, make acquaintances and stuff, and then people have to go back to their own countries, it's like, you're not really going to keep in touch, are you? I mean, maybe for a very few people, but not the majority. And if she really was blissfully unaware that a former friend and colleague had done anything wrong, why didn't she just stop and talk to him when he appeared to be discreetly following her? The sighting may or may not have been genuine, but if she really did see him, I think she may have known more than she was letting on. Under a year later, in January 1979, another sighting of Bishop was reported, this time in a restroom in a bus station in Sorrento, Italy. And, would you believe it, the person who randomly bumped into Bishop was none other than our friend Roy Harrell. Oh god, who was Roy Harrell? Roy reckons that he casually wandered into the restroom and started relieving himself right next to a bearded man who he initially took to be homeless. For some reason, Roy decided to throw a quick glance at the vagrants whilst they were both doing their business, which is a pretty strange thing to do. I mean, if I ever find myself in a urinal sandwich with two other blokes, I keep my gaze straight ahead at all times, as you should, Danny. It's the only acceptable position to have your eyes, straight ahead or looking down at yourself peeing. That's it. But Roy took the time to absorb the facial details of his lavatorial neighbor and came to the conclusion that he was about 75% sure it was his old colleague with a new beard. At this point, Rob blurted out, "Say, aren't you Brad Bishop?" It's the most old school. "Say there, old bean, aren't you Mr. Brad Bishop?" His former colleague's alleged response was to begin trembling and shaking before shouting out, "Oh my god, no!" and then running out of the restroom in blind panic, hopefully having paused to put away his tackle first. I mean, that's not the response that a seasoned foreign service agent person does, who's been on the run for a while. You'd be like, no speak the English. That's what you'd say, right? You'd just be like, "I don't know what you say, Mr. Brad." Something like this, right? Just generic. I would have thought that a man with Bishop's experience may have planned for a slightly more cool and calculated response in the event of such scenario playing out, unless he was genuinely just horrified at the prospect of spending another minute with Roy Harrell. And the FBI don't appear to have given much attention to any of Roy's claims over the years, which perhaps suggests that they viewed him as a bit of a publicity seeker who was keen to cash in on being a former colleague of a wanted murderer. He certainly gave plenty of interviews to the press, and his face was regularly wheeled out on true crime TV shows, on which he often gave slightly different retellings of his killer anecdotes. This does perhaps cast a little doubt over whether we can even believe his story of chatting to Bishop outside the office on that morning, or any of his insider knowledge on Bishop supposedly being under intense pressure from his family to earn more money. Oh, okay, he was the dude from the promotion list. The Roy dude. The third notable alleged sighting occurred in 1994 on a railway platform in Basel, Switzerland. Jean Wadsworth and her husband were former neighbours from Cataract Springs who often played tennis with Annette and Bishop down at the local club. Whilst on vacation in Basel, Jean and her husband were sitting on a stationary train when another train pulled up on the adjoining track. Jean just happened to glance through the window and spotted a well-groomed Bradford Bishop sitting on the other train and peering anxiously at his former neighbours. Why would you peer at them? If you see them and are like, "Oh my god, they're my former neighbours and I'm on the run for multiple murders of children," you'd just be like, "Get your fucking head down. Get your head down. Just hope the train leaves, get off at the next platform and get onto a different train. Or just stay there and get a car, drive away, leave the country. Don't take risks." She then claims that he quickly buried his face in a newspaper, but as his train eventually began to pull away, he gave one last bold look through the window and started laughing. No, why would you do that? The very next day, Jean called the FBI and spoke to an agent who apparently found the sighting more than credible, but she says she never heard from the FBI ever again. There was a sort of fourth notable sighting much later in 2014, but the main difference this time is that the fugitive was dead. This fresh line of inquiry had been sparked by renewed interest in the case after FBI Special Agent Stephen Voigt formed a new task force to re-examine the case in collaboration with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office and the U.S. State Department. This new task force had already used advances in technology to identify Bishop's DNA from samples lifted from items found in his Chevrolet station wagon abandoned in the Great Smoky Mountains, including his shaving kit, razor, and 7 cigarette butts which had been discarded in the ashtray. It was also largely thanks to Stephen Voigt's efforts that Bradford Bishop finally got a place on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives in April 2014, a whole 37 years after his first disappearance into the wilderness. A $100,000 reward was offered for any information leading directly to the arrest of the man who was now described as on the most wanted list as the family Annihilator. A new age progression 3D sculpture of Bishop's head had been put together by a forensic artist to illustrate how his appearance may have changed over the course of the last 37 years. And if you're still concerned that he might be hiding under an alias in your own neighborhood, the FBI released a few more clues on how to identify the fugitive, but they were quite minimal. He's 6 foot 1 inch tall, weighed 180 pounds at the time, and has brown hair and brown eyes, has a cleft chin, a facial mole on his left cheek, and a 6-inch vertical surgical scar on his lower back. 6 foot tall, 6 foot 1 inch tall is quite tall. 180 pounds, you can change your weight. So change your weight, change your hair color. Can't change your eyes. I mean, you can, but probably not back in the day. You can do this weird surgery where they change your eye color. It's kind of creepy. He had a cleft chin, can't change that. Facial mole on his left cheek, have that surgically removed. And no one's going to see that surgical scar on his lower back unless he's swimming or something. And finally, he may be intense, self-absorbed, and prone to violent outbursts. Yeah, no. I still think the FBI would have been better off just describing him as a dead ringer for Quentin Tarantino. The fresh wave of publicity generated from Bishop's new place on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list apparently led to hundreds and hundreds of new leads, although sadly nearly all of them amounted to little more than somebody spotting an old man with a dog down at the grocery store. One new point that came to light around this time was the official confirmation from the FBI that Bishop had become involved in a string of extramarital affairs in the years leading up to the murders. And some of the new leads did indeed result in the arrest of a wanted fugitive who had eluded authorities for nearly 40 years, but unfortunately, it wasn't Bradford Bishop. Okay. The FBI had received information about an elderly Bishop lookalike who was lurking suspiciously in the city of Guadalajara in Mexico. FBI agents and Mexican authorities tracked down the 81-year-old suspect, but discovered that it wasn't Bishop. It was a man called Robert Anton Woodring, who had been wanted by South Florida police for 37 years after failing to surrender to serve a 10-year prison sentence for mail fraud way back in the 1970s. Wait, I know that people have to surrender themselves for prison in white-collar crimes. But for a 10-year sentence, they're just surrender yourself when you're ready. Be like, oh shit, flee to Mexico, my dude. Although 10 years, I don't know. That's a stretch. Although you could be out in 5, right? Is that really worth fleeing your whole life? It may have taken a little too long for justice to prevail in this case, as Woodring was declared mentally incompetent when he finally faced trial in 2015 and was ordered to undergo treatment at a prison hospital. But by far the most promising new lead of all involved a suspect now only known as John Doe. Ever since 1981, a modest headstone in Cedar Hill Cemetery in Scottsboro, Alabama, has borne the simple English epitaph, "Unknown white male, died 18th of October 1981 due to accident on Highway 72, East Scottsboro, Alabama, buried November the 11th, 1981, without being identified." Scottsboro police had initially spent well over 3 weeks in vain trying to identify the man who they believe to have been homeless when he was wandering on an Alabama highway and was struck by a hit-and-run driver. Many years later, in 2014, they decided to reopen the unidentified persons case in a bid to finally get a proper name on the headstone. A coroner's photograph of the John Doe was circulated to several newspapers, including the Scottsboro Daily Sentinel, where it was absorbed by sign company salesman Jeremy Collins. Now, Jeremy must have a pretty impressive memory, as it wasn't until several months later that his wife settled down in front of the TV to watch a new CNN show called The Hunt with John Walsh, which covered the Bradford Bishop case in detail. And even though Jeremy would have discarded his copy of the Scottsboro Daily Sentinel many months ago, he felt sure that Bradford Bishop looked exactly like the unidentified man in the morgue. In fact, he felt so sure that he immediately telephoned the number that was now flashing up on the TV screen alongside an appeal for any new information. Jeremy actually had a point here. The unidentified hit-and-run man did look quite a bit like Quentin Tarantino. I mean, there were a few troubling differences between Bishop and the John Doe. For starters, John Doe was a couple of inches shorter, had blue eyes rather than brown eyes, was several pounds lighter, and looked considerably older than Bishop should have looked in 1981, where it doesn't sound like a good match at all then, does it? Although the latter 2 points could be explained by him living on the streets during the previous 5 years. The eye colour thing is going to be that's pretty a noticeable difference, though. But there were quite a few striking similarities too, including the cleft chin, thin lips, a small growth above the eye, and almost identical hairlines and sideburns. These were enough to get FBI Special Agent Stephen Voigt and Montgomery County Sheriff Darren Popkin quite excited. In fact, the lead was deemed so promising that the body of the hit-and-run victim was exhumed and DNA samples were taken from the remains and sent to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia for analysis, although there would be a nail-decomposing wait of a few weeks before any results could be confirmed. Sheriff Popkin appeared to be feeling quite optimistic. He told the public, "The similarities were incredible. After all these years, if we can confirm this is him, there is some irony with the fact that he was run over by a car without $1 in his pocket." Alas, Popkin was destined to not find his man. After comparing the DNA samples of John Doe with the samples recently extracted from the items found in Bishop's abandoned vehicle, the FBI confirmed that John Doe was most definitely not Bradford Bishop. An undeterred Sheriff Popkin later told the press, "I'm disappointed that it turned out not to be Bishop, but it makes us more determined to find him and bring him to justice." The determination may still be there, but we're still waiting for the big discovery. However, we haven't yet touched upon one major discovery in the case, which doesn't help us track down the current location of Bradford Bishop, but does give us a few more potential insights into what exactly might have been going through his head. Yeah, because it just seems like such a crazy thing to do. It's like, maybe he did it. Maybe the thing going through his head was a brain tumor. Last post. Well, there are two interesting discoveries, really, but I'm not going to spend too much time on the supposed discovery of Bradford Bishop's diary in 2000, as I've not been able to find concrete confirmation that it was definitely written by Bishop, although Sheriff Popkin seems convinced of its authenticity. The diary apparently was acquired for $38 in a flea market in Greensboro Coliseum in North Carolina before being passed on to Popkin by the buyer, and this already raises questions in my mind. If the flea market seller was aware that the diary was written by a wanted murderer, I'm sure he would have charged a lot more than $38. If the seller wasn't aware of the previous owner's identity, then why was he charging so much for a second-hand diary used by a stranger? Yeah, the price point is completely wrong here. It's either worth more or nothing. The actual contents of the diary aren't massively interesting or insightful anyway. Composed off and on between 1967 and 1971, the author moans a lot about insomnia and dreams of promotion at the US State Department. The handwriting becomes harder to read over the years, with the final almost ineligible entry from 1971 revealing a seemingly downbeat Bishop, reflecting on his life and career, quote, "Your family grows more beautiful, and you still stand on the threshold. Outwardly, your accomplishments are great. Still, you stand on the threshold. You have soared to the heights and plummeted each time to the depths." Sounds like this dude needs to be on those drugs that he's on. Or better drugs, because that seems pretty depressed. Quite a dramatic conclusion. The final entry I ever made in a diary many years ago was, "Don't forget to take videotape back to Blockbuster or Rob Dogs will get you again." Yeah, but this isn't like that's more like a to-do list. Like, there's two types of diaries, right? There's the calendar type of diary, which is like, go to the dentist, 9 a.m. Tuesday. And then there's also the, "Dear diary, today I went to the dentist. And while I was lying back in that chair, pondering on the infinite complexities of life," and suddenly, my tooth! You know, there's that kind of diary. I keep the former one, I don't keep the latter. You know, too much nasal gazing isn't good for you. Or rather, of more significance was the discovery of a letter written to Bishop in 1976, the very same year of his murders, by an inmate in the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. It's widely reported that news of this letter wasn't made public until 2010, when it was featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted. But that's not true at all. Whilst this letter may only have been published in full for the first time when it was posted on America's Most Wanted in 2010, many of the key details had been reported in the press when it was first discovered in the US State Department way back in 1992. And yet it was a discovery that was made about 16 years later than it could have been. There was no sign of the letter when investigators first searched Bishop's office for clues in the US State Department in 1976. In fairness, that's probably because the letter hadn't arrived yet. It was postmarked March 15th, 1976, just a few days after the bodies found in the shallow grave had been connected to the missing members of the Bishop family, events which the author was most likely not aware of when he posted the letter. When the letter arrived at the US State Department, a secretary simply placed it in Bishop's file without informing anybody about it, and there it remained until 1992, when Sheriff Rakite decided to send investigators over to the State Department to take a fresh peek into Bishop's files. The letter was written by armed bank robber Albert Kenneth Bankston and appeared to be the last installment in what may have been a long chain of correspondence between the inmate and the Foreign Service officer. What are you doing writing to random bank robbers? You work for the government, don't do that. Sheriff Kite believes that, amongst other things, the letter alludes to Bishop's possible original intention to hire a hitman to kill his family, rather than get his own hands dirty. But of course, there's nothing concrete in there that would stand up in court, as the letter is understandably composed in an almost impenetrably cryptic style. I would imagine that an inmate currently serving time for armed robbery would take the time to choose his words very carefully when dishing out murder tips. Yes, and all letters in and out of prison are read by guards, right? Bankston refers to an unnamed woman who was then serving time in the North Carolina State Penitentiary, leading some to speculate that this may have some connection to the mysterious Caribbean woman in the beautiful dress. Had she been part of the plot all along? Well, if so, she probably wasn't wearing a beautiful dress during her stay in the state penitentiary. And although investigators went through an exhaustive checklist of women who had been released from every prison in North Carolina during this period, they came across nothing remotely suspicious. The letter also makes references to a man called David Paul Allen and an individual only known as Sonny. Investigators were able to quickly identify the Sonny character, but he claimed to know nothing about Bradford Bishop, and he reckoned that he would never have agreed to kill children anyway, as it was against his strict criminal code. However, David Paul Allen had quite a lot more to say when the Washington Post spoke to him on the telephone in jail in Salt Lake City, where he was awaiting a parole violation hearing. Allen claimed that he knew of a couple of crooks who had received a substantial amount of money from Bishop in exchange for murdering the family whilst Bishop was away in Europe on a business trip. The plan was for the hitman to pose as repairman in order to gain access to the house, but it turns out that the crooks couldn't be trusted to do the job. They just legged it with all the dough. Yes, this is the thing. When you're doing crimes, it's like you could pay me, but it's like you don't get your money back. It's like buying drugs off the internet. It's like, well, you didn't send me my drugs. I want my money back. Don't make me take you to small claims because you were buying heroin online. It's not going to work out well for you. You've got no respite. However, whilst it seemed like Allen was singing like a canary, investigators appear to have come to the conclusion that he was embellishing his knowledge of events to get his name in the Washington Post, and most likely knew sod all about Bradford Bishop. It also seems he may have got on quite well with Roy Harrell. It also seems quite improbable that Bishop would ever have been sent on a business trip in Europe during this period anyway, as he was then permanently stationed in Washington. But I feel that the most intriguing segment of the cryptic letter is a simple line which reads, "You could walk to Phelps Lake from Cresswell. I think it's about 5 miles. While this doesn't make much sense in the context of an already baffling letter, it should be noted that both of these locations are very close to the area where Bishop buried his victims. As I say, it's impossible to glean any definitive facts from this exercise in cryptography, but the fact that Albert Kenneth Bankston refers to such specific locations whilst name-dropping known convicts does seem to suggest that this was not a casual chat between two unlikely pen pals, and it possibly adds real weight to the theory that the Bishop family murders were never about a man who suddenly lost the plot one morning. It was more about a plot that a man had been secretly hatching over a much longer period. It might have been quite handy if investigators could have spoken to the author of the letter. This would have been very possible if they hadn't left it 16 years before they nipped back to Bishop's office for a second look, after Albert Kenneth Bankston died from cancer while in prison in 1983. Former Sheriff Rakite later acknowledged that things could have panned out very differently if the letter had been found much earlier. Running in the family. There was another much more recent discovery, which admittedly doesn't have very much to do with the case itself, but must have been pretty mind-boggling for the person involved. You may remember that around the exact same time that Bishop was burying his victims, we mentioned something else that was taking place, the beauty pageant, right? Miss Stroughton, yeah, it's right there. Taking place about 700 miles away in the town of Stroughton, Massachusetts. An 18-year-old student named Kathy Gilchrist was being crowned Miss Stroughton. Born in 1957, Kathy was the adopted daughter of Jack and Norma Sidebottom. Growing up in Stroughton, Kathy had never been particularly curious about her biological parents. All she'd ever known about her origins is that her biological mother had given Kathy to the New England Home for Little Wanderers very shortly after birth. It wasn't until 2017 that Kathy Gilchrist, now living in North Carolina, began to grow a little bit more curious about potential blood relatives as she approached retirement age. After taking a home DNA test acquired from 23andMe, she was swiftly connected with a third cousin on her mother's side by the name of Susan Gilmore, who lived in Maine. Susan wasn't just a newly found relative who instantly clicked with Kathy, she was also something of an amateur genealogist herself and encouraged Kathy to dig a little deeper with a second DNA test, this time from Ancestry DNA. Wait, aren't they going to do exactly the same thing? They're both sequencing your DNA and then putting it into... I guess they maybe have different databases, but can't you just upload your DNA profile to the other website? I think you can. Susan ultimately helped Kathy to track down no less than 7 half-siblings. Her biological mother had raised 3 children after settling down with her husband, but none of them had ever been aware that she had given up several children for adoption during her younger years, one of whom was Kathy Gilchrist. However, it was a tougher job tracking down any details of Kathy's biological father, until one day Kathy received a phone call from Susan, who began the conversation by asking if Kathy was sitting down. It's never a good thing to start a conversation. It's like, all right, you want to take a seat? It's like, no, why did you say I don't like this? Susan had finally figured out the identity of Kathy's biological father. He just happened to be a wanted murderer on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. It was Bradford Bishop. No way. Kathy remains in shocked silence for several moments before she eventually burst out laughing at the sheer absurdity of the news. She later explained to the press that she was raised by people with a great sense of humor. Luckily, both Kathy and Susan were convinced that they'd found the right man, particularly as Kathy noted that she bore more of a resemblance to Bishop's 3 sons than her own children. But Kathy still wanted official confirmation. She asked the FBI and the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office to compare her own DNA with the samples of Bishop's DNA found in his Chevrolet station wagon. Her request was initially denied on the grounds that the results couldn't possibly prove to be of any help in tracking down Bishop. A statement released by the FBI at one time made the position clear. Our DNA records are confidential and restricted to criminal justice agencies for law enforcement identification purposes, which, to be fair, that's a pretty sound policy. Yet 4 years later, in 2021, the FBI had a sudden change of heart for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Maybe they just got quite curious themselves during a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Thanks to a shaving kit, a razor, and 7 discarded cigarette butts, the FBI was able to confirm that Bradford Bishop was indeed Kathy Gilchrist's biological father. Well, how about that? As Kathy was born in 1957, this meant that Bishop hooked up with Kathy's biological mother after he had first started dating his future wife and murder victim, Annette, at high school, but a couple of years before Bishop and Annette were married. We'll never know if Kathy's biological mother ever realized that she'd conceived a child with someone who'd later go on to murder his family. And just to confuse matters further, an entirely different name is listed as the father on Kathy's birth certificate. Some have speculated that this recent development may help to finally bring Bishop out of hiding, but considering the man's history, I'm not so sure that would be a good idea. No, he murdered his family. He's not going to be like, oh my god, I have a daughter? I must go meet her. Probably not something that goes through the mind of the dude who killed his children. Kathy herself says that she'd be up for meeting him under a supervised setting, but as she put it, do I want him to knock on my door? No, thank you. The final stretch. Bradford Bishop didn't actually keep his place on the 10 most wanted list for very long, just over 4 years in fact. That's sadly not because he was caught, it's because he was dropped from the list to make room for another fugitive who might pose a more immediate threat to society. Considering that he'd now be pushing 87, even if he's still alive, and he doesn't appear to have committed any further crimes over the last 47 years, it's perhaps understandable why the FBI's list would rather focus on villains who are more likely to strike again in the near future. He might very well not still be alive, of course. In fact, some people are of the opinion that Bradford Bishop never even made it past March 1976. There are those who still cling to the idea that Bishop himself was the 6th and final victim in an incredibly well-organized stitch-up, which was payback for his time working as an international super spy. Danny's making this like sarcastic, but I'm like, yeah, maybe. But there are also those who believe that Bishop never made it out of the Great Smoky Mountains and that he took his own life very shortly after abandoning his vehicle. It's a theory which would appear to be immediately blown out of the water by the sight of a man matching Bishop's description, later using his credit card to purchase a pair of tennis shoes about 125 miles away with a Leo lookalike in tow, unless that was just another fragment of a quite remarkable stitch-up. However, yeah, I know it's not very likely, but it's not like wildly impossible. Nations have lots of money and experience in stitching people up and making it look completely legit. It's like well within their wheelhouse. However, there is something quite strange concerning the items that Bishop left behind in his station wagon. If he was packing up to start a new life in a mystery location, why did he leave behind his shaving kit, the packet of dog biscuits, and most importantly of all, his medication? You'd think that all of those items would be pretty important things to pack for the next leg of his trip. The theory goes that he left them in the vehicle because he had no further use for a shaving kit, dog biscuits, or medication as he took Leo for a final short walk into the woods. Oh, I see. Yes, but he was seen 125 miles away quite a short time later using his credit card. I don't think so. It's weird that he left the medication. Like, that's something people don't leave. Quite aside from the tennis shoes purchase, I find this scenario highly unlikely, as it would make all of Bishop's subsequent actions after the murders largely pointless. If he'd always intended to take his own life, he may as well have done it at home. There would be no logical reason to drive 300 miles to North Carolina to dispose of all the bodies and then drive a further 400 miles to the Great Smoky Mountains. That sounds more like the actions of a man who was keen to get rid of the evidence and move on, rather than just take his own life in the woods. Having said that, I suppose it's not impossible that he and Leo went for a quick stroll in the Great Smoky Mountains and got eaten by bears. However, I mean, again, totally possible, or just got lost. Although they said he was quite an outdoorsman earlier on, he's probably not going to get lost. However, the FBI and Montgomery County Sheriff's Office are still working on the assumption that Bradford Bishop is still very much alive today, even if they concede that any hope of catching him now diminishes with every passing day. FBI Special Agent Karen Cody has taken over the case since 2018 and claims that new leads are still regularly coming in from the public, but the chances of ever catching up with the 87-year-old fugitive do appear to be pretty remote. His predecessor, Stephen Voigt, now believes that Bishop may well have been in hiding in plain sight all along and never even left the country. As Bishop was a keen outdoorsman, Voigt suggests that he may have drawn upon these skills to lie low in the local area for quite some time before emerging from the woods to take on a new identity. Yeah, hiding in the woods if you know how to, that seems like a pretty good idea. America's got some really big woods, and I guess the Great Smoky Mountains or whatever, they're probably quite great and smoky and like mysterious and big. You could hide in there for a while, just living in a little shelter and eating some fish and whatnot. Stephen Voigt observed, "It's much easier to fade into the background of your own country without having to get fake papers in another country. You get overseas, and it doesn't matter how many languages you speak, you're still an American. You stand out." Yes, but there's also plenty of places where there's lots of Americans. Like, I live in Prague. I don't think Americans particularly stand out here. There's lots of Americans. You see them around. You're like, oh, look, Americans. It's like, it's a big capital city. There's lots of foreigners. He may have a point, but a more widely held belief is that a murderer who reportedly longed to escape his office desk and travel the world again drew upon his vast international experience, military training, and multilingual skills to carve out a completely new identity abroad, where he kept his nose clean and fell completely under the radar for the remainder of his life. Perhaps he might not have succeeded if his old next-door neighbor, Alvina Long, had ventured into the kitchen that day after the murders, and Bishop had not been granted a head start of at least 2 weeks. Or if the FBI had not waited 37 years to put him on the most wanted list, or if investigators had not waited 16 years to take a second look at Bishop's old office at the US State Department, where a letter from Bankston had been waiting to be found since 1976. Although in fairness, I'm not sure how they could have predicted that a wanted murderer would have continued to receive fresh correspondence from a convicted bank robber a few days after their first visit. I think the policing in this one pretty excellent. I think they did what they could. I think they continue to do what they can. It's just this guy is one of the, like, normally on casual criminalists, there's not that many people who don't get caught. This dude just seems like he was smart enough and connected enough and all of this to just not get caught. And that's exactly what he's done. Sadly, as things stand today, we have no real clue as to the whereabouts of Bradford Bishop or what exactly he was doing with that mystery Caribbean woman in a beautiful dress. The family Annihilator may well still be out there, so please do remember to stay vigilant should you ever bump into an aged Quentin Tarantino body double with a facial mole on his left cheek who suddenly whips out a packet of peanuts. I have to admit that I'm slightly disappointed that I wasn't suddenly hit by a wave of breaking news as I was reaching the end of this script. I mean, yeah, it's quite unlikely though. It's been a long time since this happened, Danny. The way my last few casual criminal scripts has gone, I was half expecting to hear that Bradford Bishop had finally been caught posing as a croupier in Rotherham, just as I thought I'd reach my last full stop. But no such luck in this case. Unless, of course, a big revelation broke rather inconveniently after this video has already been recorded, in which case I'm going to take a punt and say that I knew Bradford Bishop and Leo were secret communist spies all along. And just to satisfy my curiosity, Bradford Bishop news. No exciting news about old Bradford Bishop, but I do see why people say he looks like Quentin Tarantino. God damn, he does. All right. That's the end of today's episode. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day. And tune in next time. Thanks for being here.